quite clearly a case of a player being deliberately pinned in a ruck, couldn't move, but he gave the penalty. Unsympathetic. I was a doubter too, just based on what we'd seen in the past, but I think he's found a happy place there. He's got obviously stability in his life. There's still a chance for them on the back of what we saw in the game against the Crusaders that they'll make the top
Well, you
six.
look at the stats, possession, the territory, all in favour of the Blues.
I might be in the minority here, but I actually think a draw in a game of rugby it's a legitimate
result.
outcome.
DSPN, the Devlin Sports Podcast Network.
Super Rugby Round 10. We normally do our big rugby wrap-up on a Monday, but of course the long weekend. So today it is. Tony Johnson joining us from Sky Sport as always. It was another rambunctious round of rugby, I thought highlighted by the Crusaders-Blues match. And I want to start there, Tone. Welcome back as we head into Anzac weekend. On my own rugby rankings, for what it's worth, and no, that's just, something we do every week. The Blues lost. They've only won a third of their games. I've elevated them up. I saw enough from them, especially in the second half against the Crusaders, to say, if this team makes it, which I think that they will, no other team is going to want to play them.
Yeah, first and foremost, they made it into a really good game. People could say that the conditions were a bit of a leveller, that they might have reduced the margin. And in the end, it took a couple of really good clutch penalties by James O'Connor to win the game. And boy, is he paying them back.
Isn't he just?
Yeah. Anyway, the Blues, I agree. I think we saw enough there that they're still going to be contenders. They've got a tough one this week against the Reds, and they're not going to be anywhere near full strength.
No.
I understand Papali'i, Clark,
yep,
and
both out,
and Bowden Barrett has been unwell. So that'll be a tough one. But you look at what comes after that. They've got the Force at home. They've got a game against the Drua, who are really struggling at the moment, even though they had that win at the weekend, anywhere other than Lautoka. They've got Moana, Pasifika, and they've got a home game against the Tars in the last round, when who knows how important that would be. But I look at that and I say, no, there's still a chance for them on the back of what we saw in the game against the Crusaders that they'll make the top six.
Well, you look at the stats, and that's what got me, is that, after the first half, the possession, the territory, all in favour of the Blues. Then the second half started, and I would have thought that Canterbury would have wrestled some of that back. But again, the Blues just were camped down their end. Courageous defence from the Crusaders. The Blues maybe botched a couple of opportunities, but I just thought that's the team that won it last year. That was much more of it.
Yeah, I think the conditions probably suited the style of game that they've been playing. I still think that if they are going, to go deep into this competition, they need to make more use of the talent that they've got out wide. And look, they'll know that too. But as I say, in the end, Crusaders won it, and they showed more of that traditional Crusaders resolve, ability to play the big minutes better than other teams do.
Well, when it came down to that last stanza where there was a scrum and you're thinking they're going to get a penalty here, they're going to play for a penalty here, and then is he going to step up and kick it? And as you say, at the start, I was a doubter. I thought he was too old. I didn't know what contribution he would make. I didn't think he would start at number 10. But coming on for these cameo appearances is just perfect, isn't it? He's the perfect guy to come on and just wrap a game up.
Yeah, to the point where they're now starting to talk about him being a wild card for Wallaby selection. I can't see that happening.
Okay.
But you think about it. You're playing the Lions and the series goes down to the wire, and you've got, particularly if you've got some French referee ready to pull the trigger, who would you want there in those moments? But as I say, I don't think it'll happen. But no, I was a doubter too, just based on what we'd seen in the past. But I think he's found a happy place there. He's got obviously stability in his life, and that everything's going well. But again, going back to the Crusaders, they took advantage. The Blues, obviously, with Ufa being out for the season, Marcel Renat has had issues with injury as well. So they had a couple of sort of greenish props in there. And I thought Fletcher Newell was a guy who really stood up and just reminded everyone why this guy has been an All Black.
I totally agree. And not only that, I love the niggle that came with that game as well. I love the verbal that was going. I love the players giving it to each other because it means something. The other big result of the weekend, and you mentioned it, the Drua winning at home. And, credit to you, you said last week, and you've been saying it over the last couple of weeks, that they have a part to play and that they are going to win games. Now, they beat a New South Wales side that had just come off getting smacked in New Zealand, beat the Chiefs, then go over there, and this fortress they've got at Churchill Park seems to be working for them.
Yeah, and they'll probably be rueing the fact that, to keep it even, that they have committed to a certain number of games in Suva, because, firstly, it's not the easiest thing to be able to fork out for tickets, week in, week out. They've got the rugby people of Suva have got to see their games as well, but I'm sure deep down Glenn Jackson will be wishing that all of their games were at Lautoka. They've got some issues though, even though they won that game, and we talked about it last week, dropping a couple of quite key players. What I'm hearing about what's going on at the Drua is that a number of their top players, a significant number of their players have signed big contracts
in France,
to go to France, and that they may be kind of looking after themselves because these are life-changing contracts. What they're on at the moment is good. It gives them a degree of comfort, but what they would get paid in France changes their whole lives. And I wonder whether some of them...
Clarkey brought this up actually a couple of weeks ago with us. He said he hinted at the same thing. So, obviously your intel's really good for both of you. And look, I know that half of me says, well, that's not right. But the other half says that makes sense because we're talking about a completely different way of life here, Tony.
Yeah.
And as you say, a life-changing contract, 3 or 4 years in France, getting paid that kind of money means that you're setting up your family.
Yeah.
I get it. At the same time, it's not very professional.
No, and it's disappointing that it's come to that because to me, what I kind of hoped, and maybe naively, was that the Drua and Moana Pasifika, for that matter, would not just see players homegrown, but would draw players back from overseas to want to be part of it. And that really hasn't happened. In fact,
this is the antithesis of that, really, isn't it?
And no, it's exactly what I was about to say. That it is. It's the opposite of what I'd hoped would happen. And you didn't really want Super Rugby, for the sake of the competition, to be a bit of a showcase for talent to be snapped up by overseas. But I guess that's a harsh reality.
It happens to the New Zealand teams as well, mate.
And of course the worry about Fiji is that at the same time the French clubs are picking off players at a much younger age to go into these club academies over there.
And then they get to play for France.
And then they get to play for France. And you think about all the flack that's been thrown at New Zealand over the years. I can't name one single player who has been lured to New Zealand at school age because you'll be an All Black or that sort of. It's all been about their education and the opportunity to play rugby and be part of a good system. But it's a bit more, I suppose, blatant when it comes to France. But that's the reality that Glenn Jackson's facing at the moment, and also the fact that he's got two players and two quite significant players have now got themselves into issues off the field. It sounds like they're going to go before the courts, and so that's just compounding things. But as I say, no one goes to Lautoka in particular thinking this is going to be a nice, easy afternoon.
It's going to be a challenging place for the Blues to go. I agree with you. I think they're still going to win some games.
I think they're in Suva.
They're in Suva, right.
Yeah.
I can see them, well, even if they don't beat the Reds, winning out from here. What are they, 3-6? They got 5 games left to play. As far as the Highlanders and the Hurricanes go, Hurricanes are going to be kicking themselves again. But I say this every week. It just seems like this has been their whole season, hasn't it? Before we talk about the Highlanders, let's talk about that team that, I don't know, I expect them to be better than they are. They now go to the Brumbies, which is a hell of a place to go and try and get a win. Mathematically, they've still got a chance, but is mathematically realistically?
I think you look back at that game that played in Perth over the weekend, and the Force get more from that draw than the Hurricanes do. It's a couple of points away from home, a draw away from home. If you're playing in the English Premier League, you're quite happy with it. But this is one that's kind of slipped away, and I'd say the Force would be happy because it keeps them inside the 6. Yep. I still think they're the ones that are vulnerable to slip out of there. Look, own worst enemies. They had opportunities, didn't nail them, a couple of injudicious plays. I still think that there was a little bit about the way it finished when you consider that the Force were presented with a chance to win the game from a penalty where it was quite clearly a case of a player being deliberately pinned in a ruck, couldn't move, but he gave the penalty. Unsympathetic. If he'd been consistent, there might have been a penalty against the Force close to their own line. Would have been an easy 3-pointer to win the game from a player who, to me, I'm not convinced was rolling out in accordance with the law. Those are the sort of swings and roundabouts things that even themselves out over the course of the season. And I don't want to get into that blame the referee thing because we heard far too much of that last week. But that was a little bit iffy. But But the bottom line is they had chances to win the game, and they didn't
chances to
take
beat
it.
the Blues twice, Tony.
Yeah, and you won't get away with that against the Brumbies either. You go to Canberra, you have got to take every single chance, be it a matter of 3 points, 5 points, 7 points, whatever that comes your way, because they were pretty ruthless the way they dispatched Moana Pasifika at the
Blanked
weekend.
them, and that's I don't know when's the last time Moana didn't get any points, but the last 2 weeks, let's look at them: 17 against the Blues and none against the Brumbies, and this was a team that was averaging well over 30 points. Okay, so they were conceding, but they were scoring high 30s, I think it was. So they were shut down. That was clinical from the Brumbies.
It was, yeah.
And the way they played their rugby was, I thought, a real warning to the New Zealand sides. I've elevated them up as they're the best Aussie side, even though they lost to the Reds in my view.
I'm thinking, it sort of wavers week in, week out, doesn't it?
It doesn't. That's the beauty of it, isn't it?
They'll both be in the mix, which is interesting because they might end up playing each other in the playoffs, which we could talk about in a moment.
Sorry, did the Brumbies beat the Reds? I think the Brumbies did beat the Reds, didn't they? No, the Reds have only lost to the Chiefs and the Crusaders.
Well, look, either way, they're still going to be right up against each other.
No, 5-3. No, sorry, Brumbies won in Brisbane. God, weeks go on. Sorry,
that's what I say. I think last week that my needle had moved back towards the Brumbies, where I've been saying the Reds all along.
Yeah, I get that.
Reds, they play the Blues this week, don't they? But look, we could, as I say, the format's going to be interesting. When it gets,
I want to get into this, and just before we do, though, the Highlanders, who again 10 points scored against the Chiefs, and look, I like this side. I want them to do well. We had Jamie on the program early. Sorry, name dropping. Jamie Joseph on the program. Earlier on in the season, and he's very honest about what he's got in front of him. They've only got one All Black in that side, and obviously when injuries they do get thin. Is it a case now that for New Zealand, we can't expect all 5 of our teams to be top 6 sides and all 5 of them to be good? Do we not have that, what we used to think was that depth now, 120 Super Rugby level players?
Well, particularly when the Australians have squeezed back into 4, no, it's probably not realistic. I still think, I'd be very reluctant to give up a New Zealand team because of the geographical spread, the pathways and all that sort of thing, established pathways that you'd be
Well, they're not going to be a crap team, but they're just not going to be a team that's...
Yeah, look, I think one of the biggest problems that the Highlanders have had, they've had 3 trips to Australia and they haven't won a game over there. I think that's been an issue for them. Look, they were right in the hunt. Well, on the scoreboard, they were right in the hunt at halftime against the Chiefs, and then the second half it sort of fell away, and I think that probably does underline that they don't have the depth coming off the bench, whereas the Chiefs can bring 125 All Black caps into the game. Quite sort of ruthless.
Who's your best team then, Tony, out of the Chiefs and the Crusaders at the moment? Because both of at times looked not wobbly, but both looked to me like they can be beaten. Yeah. But they still win every week.
Yeah, I think some of it might come down to who gets to play where.
Because that game, I think it's round 15 that they play, or round 13 that they play each other. Yeah. And that might determine who ends up being
in the poll and who ends up on the other front row position on the grid. Yeah.
So when it comes down to this top 6 then, because we've been arguing about this, me and Lachlan, over the last couple of days about so how it works. I know there's a weird anomaly in it, isn't there, where you can lose a game and still make a semi-final or something.
Yeah, okay. So when they came up with the top 6 format, I just assumed that it would be the way other top 6 formats work around the world, where the top 2 teams get a week off.
Yep.
And then the other 2 play in what you call minor semi-finals, and the winners go through and play one of the top 2 teams.
So it's a 3-week final system, basically.
Yeah. But that's not how it's going to work. And I was a bit surprised about this.
Okay.
And as you have alluded to, and I think it's got something to do, it will have something to do with the broadcaster, because remember, with one less team, there are fewer games. And I think there is a requirement to provide a certain number of games in a season to the broadcasters.
Well, that's a contract thing, I'm sure there is.
Who pay the big money. Yeah. And so what's going to happen is that there are going to be 3 playoff games in the first week. 1 will play 6, 2 will play 5, 3 will play 4. Now you think, how do you get 4 teams out of that? Well, obviously the 3 winners will go through, and then the highest ranked loser, I think, is how it works out. And they are going to, I think, re-rank them at that point. So one of the teams that loses will be what they call in tennis qualifying tournaments a lucky loser.
A lucky loser.
And will survive. So what it means is that if you finish high up the table, then you get the potential for a 2 life, which is it happens in some
Well, it happens in rugby league. It happens in the NRL competition.
A two-life system. So outwardly, it does look a little bit complicated. Far more complicated than we talked about.
Well, I just assumed it was one, and okay,
but that's not going to be the case, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of talk about it at the time. But there are reasons for it, and the fact is there'll still be something to play, even if you're in that 3v4 game where you sort of think, well, if 1 and 2 win. Whoever loses that game stays in the competition. It might not be that simple.
So if
when
it was
the time
something
comes.
okay, so say one did happen to lose to 6. Say the Blues managed to finish 6th, right, and they do upset. Does home advantage still go to the teams that finished higher?
Well, no, they'd be regraded, and so they would have to play away.
Regardless, because they finished 6th.
Because they lost. If one got beaten, but remained the highest ranked loser, they would stay in.
But they'd have to play away.
They'd have to play away from home. I think that's that's just me surmising. But I
you
think
need a degree in applied mathematics for this, don't you?
It's not perfect science, but it's what they've decided on, as I say, as a means of trying to fulfil the commitment to the number of games that they have
One
to play.
final question before we wrap up: should there be draws? Because the Canes and the Force both said afterwards they wanted to keep playing this game. And I find this a little confusing. You have 80 minutes, but we're not allowed to draw. But at the end of the golden point period of extra time, if you're still drawn, you're allowed the draw.
Well, they can't keep on playing forever.
Well, so what's the answer?
Player safety, Martin. Health and safety.
Do you finish at 80 minutes? If you've already decided a draw is okay, which you've already decided, why don't you just finish at 80 minutes and have a draw?
Well, I might be in the minority here, but I actually think a draw in a game of rugby it's a legitimate
result.
outcome.
Yeah.
Not perhaps. And I don't like contrived finishes. The only thing I like about a contrived finish, that being extra time or golden point or penalty shootouts or things like that, is it does stop people talking about kissing their sister. Okay, that's the only thing that I really don't like about a draw.
When you put it like that, yes.
Yeah. So,
but look, it's to me.
But if I think if it's what the people want, because whenever there is a draw, people say, "Why don't we have golden point?" But you can't keep on playing.
I don't like it. I just don't like the fact that it turns rugby and rugby league into a drop goal fest, which isn't what the game actually is, right?
But the other thing too is that if you've got, especially if you're a team and you're on a shortish turnaround and you've played an extra 20 minutes,
to
determine the outcome of a game, that does put you at a disadvantage. So it has to have an end point somewhere.
Yeah.
But hey, just one other thing before I go.
Sure.
New Zealand teams in Australia, New Zealand teams have to play less games in Australia, fewer games in Australia than vice versa.
Oh my God, have you gone through the whole draw?
Well, I had a look at it. Someone said something the other day, and so far, New Zealand teams have played 5 games in Australia, 1 draw and 4 losses, I think is how it works out. By the end of it, the Australian teams all have to play 3 games in New Zealand, and so far have picked up a couple of wins. Blues play the Reds this week in Brisbane. It's their only trip across the Tasman in the round robin.
Wow.
Chiefs lost to the Waratahs.
Yeah.
Only game that they had to play.
Okay, wow.
So
good
far.
stats. Good stats.
Whereas the poor old Highlanders have had to play 3 and they've lost them all. So there's a bit of an imbalance there, which to me, in some ways, legitimises the situation we have at the moment where there are 4 Australian teams in the top 6.
Who wins then? Wrap it up, Reds versus Blues. Who wins that crucial game?
I think with their injuries, Reds at home, I probably might lean towards the Reds here. But look, if the Blues win it, to me, it just underlines, they will definitely make the top 6.
This is the DSPN.